The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
We are incredibly lucky this morning to have Dr. Douglas Anderson lead us. Yeah, round of applause. Exactly. Doug is not only a professor, but Doug is also a clerk emeritus of our session. Is that true?
That is true.
That is true.
Good office to hold.
Yeah. Amen, bro. Amen. He did. He did. Doug is going to lead us in a talk entitled
Journey to Peace in Northern Ireland.
Journey to Peace in Northern Ireland. This is guaranteed to be fantastic. We have 8 online participants as well. And so hello to all of our virtual participants. And a special memory right now for the 29 of us that are currently in Scotland. They worshiped at Glasgow Cathedral this morning. And so that is where many of our members happen to be, as well as Reverend Rebecca, who usually would be doing what I'm doing. I'm just doing my best to fill in her stead. Let us pray. Loving God, we give you great thanks for this moment today to learn, to share, and to grow together. Be with us, be with Doug. May his words be like lights to our feet, and bless this entire time. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Friends, I know. Me, like a Bond accident, that's for sure. Friends, without further ado, Doug Anderson.
Thank you very much. All right, let's get on. Big professorial type. I have to have a lot of PowerPoints. I do. There we are. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know why it won't work on my laptop, but it's on my phone.
I'll speak up, and I'm going to do this way as opposed to trying to use the microphones, because that'll make a feedback mess for everything. Thank you so very much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate this. I was asked to do this for 2 reasons, really. Our youth are doing a mission trip this summer to both Northern Ireland and
You have to actually pay attention.
of our faith and the troubles that exist in Northern Ireland. And that was one part of it. And the other part of it was apparently whoever was supposed to do adult formation this Sunday is in Scotland with that other group. And so there was a gap in the schedule. All right, I'll do that. I can do that. So what I'm going to do this morning is try to provide some historical context to Northern Ireland, describe what it is, because a lot of people don't even understand it. They think, oh, that's just part of Ireland. What the troubles were, how that came to be the case, how peace was essentially achieved, if you will, and what that status is in the island today. Now, it's actually very timely, because last Monday, April the 10th, was the 25th anniversary of what's known as the Good Friday Agreement, which was a document of reconciliation and power sharing between the parties in conflict in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. It's been kind of an exciting week. Everybody has been in on the celebration. Joe Biden stopped briefly in Belfast on his spring break tour to Ireland. Didn't say anything of consequence, but didn't get into trouble. So I'm pretty happy about that, quite frankly. But more importantly, tomorrow and Tuesday and Wednesday, former President Clinton, his wife Hillary Clinton, are going there for a huge panel discussion about the Belfast Agreement. They'll be joined by former Prime Minister Tony Blair, former Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, and Senator George Mitchell, who is in fact the most instrumental part of putting together the Belfast Agreement, as it's more formally known. And there's a pretty good article in today's Washington Post about George Mitchell and that process. I would recommend it to you. All right, so what I'm trying to do is get little things that pop up there. Give you sort of an understanding of what Northern Ireland is, how it came to be, how the troubles evolved, and how Northern Ireland went past those troubles. The little murals that you see are not old. They are current on various walls, both in Derry and in Belfast. This is a sectarian struggle, which does have some religious elements to it as well, but it's really a clash of cultures, which has been going on now for about 1,000 years. And so there's a real issue about its ability to be resolved anytime soon. So what's Ireland? Well, everybody thinks of Ireland as that lovely green country. We go there on vacation, we have a grand time. Historically, Ireland was made up of 4 provinces: Ulster in the north, Leinster, which is near Dublin, Munster down in the south west, and then Connacht in the far west. It was a land of clans for thousands of years, and control of those clans were by kings of clans and various internecine warfare which carried on. That has consequence because it didn't lead itself to a united country at any time in its history. And that matters when the English began to pay attention. In the north, we have Ulster, 9 of the 32 counties that are there. And this becomes what's now known as Northern Ireland. And I'll pop up this little map. This happened only in 1921. So this difference had been brewing for 1,000 years and really did not come to fruition, that there was a separation of these sectarian groups until that time. Now, Ireland, like all of Europe, quite frankly, going back 500 years to St. Patrick, St. Column, St. Bridget, Irish were Catholic, as were everybody else in England, in Scotland, in France, Spain. All of Western Europe was Catholic, but change began over time to slowly come, and that's going to be a big part of the story. Now, I'm going to take a moment and try to give you an understanding of the differences by which people are identified, okay? When we think of Ireland, when we think of the Irish, we think of things green, right? They've got the shamrocks and you know, the map itself is green. These people are people that consider them in the north, in Ulster. These people are people who consider themselves Irish. They feel Irish. They are mostly, but not exclusively, Catholic. There are Protestants that feel the same way. They refer to themselves in the north, in Northern Ireland, as nationalists and Republicans. Nationalists because they believe that that part of the island should be part of the nation, part of the Republic of Ireland. Hence, they refer to themselves as nationalists and most commonly Republicans. On the other side are those people who are loyal to the monarchy, the Loyalists, and who believe in the union of Northern Ireland with the rest of the United Kingdom, that it's an integral part, and they are unionists. Again, mostly, but not exclusively Protestant, and they kind of feel British, okay? And I'll come back to the political parties in a little bit. So how do we get to this split? Well, I'm going to do a really fast dive into English history. I'm asking Roger to forgive me on everything I get wrong before I even begin it. All right, so fair enough. All right, it all starts really back in about 1171 with King Henry invading Ireland. And he takes control of this land. He's actually holding it in trust for the Pope. He's not the King of Ireland, he's just the Lord of Ireland, but it's now part of his kingdom for all intents and purposes. Going with him, a whole lot of Anglo-Norman invaders who settle in to the land and they basically go native. They intermarry with those Gaelic clans that are there, and they come onto the land and they absolutely love it. And they begin not to pay too much attention to what's happening in England. Well, the problem with that is England gets involved in lots and lots of long and rather pointless wars with France in particular, but other parts of continental Europe. It's the 100 Years' War, and everybody's focused on that, and nobody's focused on this island, even though they theoretically control it. Actual control of Ireland shrinks back to a very small piece surrounding Dublin called the Pale, a series of staked walls that partition what's considered civilization there in the Dublin area from everything else that is not civilized. Hence that phrase that you've heard, beyond the pale. Okay, yeah, that's where that came from. So we go and we're plodding along, and we've got the 100 Years' War, and we've got the War of the Roses, which is sort of an internecine fight on who's going to have the crown. And then we get to this one fellow we all know about, Henry VIII. Interesting character, interesting time, not only in the history of England, but interesting times in Europe. He doesn't get along with the Pope, and he wants to divorce his wife, and the Pope won't give him a divorce. So he starts the Church of England.
right? And breaks away from papal Catholicism. At the same time, you've got Martin Luther nailing up his theses in Wittenberg, Germany. At the same time, you've got the Calvinist movement in Scotland, and all of a sudden we've got Presbyterianism being born. And it all happens at this time. It's important to our story because we begin this sort of back and forth over the next several monarchs. Are we going to be a Catholic country? Are we going to be a Protestant country? What are we doing here? And it gets down to the uniter, James I of England, James VI of Scotland, and now we have a united country, and times have come together with a Protestant king. And in 1603, a number of interesting things happened, which are really important in Northern Ireland. The last of the great clan chiefs in Ulster, Hugh O'Neill in particular, are defeated in battle and leave Northern Ireland. And there's nothing there for the Gaelic people to hold on to in terms of leadership and structure. King James sees a wonderful opportunity for economic growth and expansion and creates the system known as the plantations of Ulster, where they actively recruit yeoman farmers, serfs, and others to leave the lowlands of Scotland and the Midlands of England and move en masse to areas of Northern Ireland, which they are going to exploit agriculturally, develop villages, and basically pull an entire Protestant culture into this part of Ireland that did not exist before. And it becomes very quickly the dominant culture of this land. There were already Scots in the northern part of Ireland because they had fled Scotland, mostly Presbyterians, due to persecution, something to bear in mind. We are Presbyterians, we are Protestants, but that doesn't mean that at this time our interests and beliefs were aligned with the formal Church of England. And in fact, we were persecuted for our non-conforming beliefs. And those of you who are going on the trip to Scotland, you'll learn about this. There was terrible persecution. So that's where we are, and things go on. Continued strife in England. They're good about that. They go back and forth. Who's going to be the king? What are we going to believe? Oh, let's get rid of the king. Let's put up a civilian. He'll be a nice fellow. Oliver Cromwell didn't work out so well. They throw him out. They restore the monarchy. And finally, we get down to James II. And we think we're in good shape now because James II has now united control England, Scotland, Ireland. But he's facing a land. England is Anglican, obviously. Scotland has now become completely Presbyterian. Ireland continues to be a land of the Gaelic Irish because it's not just their religion, it's their culture, and they're not really accepting of an Anglican or Protestant monarchy. Problem with James is he starts off really well. He marries an Anglican woman and bears a daughter, Mary, and that's good. So everybody's happy about that. We're going to continue to have a Protestant monarchy upon succession. But she dies and he marries a second woman who's Catholic, and he has a son, James, who's going to be James III, and he's going to be Catholic. And the people of England said, you know, we've had enough of this. We're a Protestant land and we want to stay that way. We don't care what the king does. We've got to do something. So they looked at Mary, who had married this little fellow from Holland, and said, you know, what we really ought to do, he's living over there, what we really ought to do, we ought to have him come over and they can be queen and king together. Yeah, let's do that. So they literally invited William to invade their country and overthrow James II. This is known as the Glorious Revolution. And this was Mary and William of Orange, co-monarchs of the land. And that's the same William and Mary that gave the property that some of you may go to William and Mary or have been there. So that's them. So they come over and William comes over and James flees Ireland. He's gone. Okay. Flees England and he's gone. Great. But which James wants his country back. He's in France. He gathers up support of the French. To begin to take back control of his kingdom, he goes to Ireland and raises troops, and he's going to take control of Ireland and then come back across the Irish Sea, and here we go. William decides we have to stop this now. He didn't kill him, didn't have him beheaded, should have, but it would have made him a martyr, but now he's got to deal with it. So there is in Ireland 2 significant battles for control of the land, which drive the culture of Northern Ireland to this day. And we'll learn about both of them when we're there. The first is the Siege of Derry in 1688. Derry, or Londonderry as it's also known, is a walled city. In fact, I think it's the largest walled city in Europe that's extant. And James's forces attempted to siege the city. Young apprentice boys locked the gates and everybody stayed in, and they held out for 105 days of siege until forces of William were able to rescue them. It was not an inconsequential battle. Between mortars and starvation, over 4,000 people died in that walled city in that 3.5-month period. The siege of Derry is liberated. The people of Derry celebrate that liberation to this day. The other significant element was what's called the Battle of the Boyne, which was the last great significant land battle between James and William on the land of Ireland. William fights him at the River Boyne and defeats James's army, which also included elements of the French, on July 12th of 1690. And this was it. This was the domination of the Protestant king over the Catholic king. And it happened in Northern Ireland, and that is celebrated to this day. The little picture here are members of the Loyal Orange Order, and it is a fraternal organization which has a march, or multiple marches in villages throughout all of Northern Ireland on the 12th of July. They also have huge bonfires the evening before. And they are very proud of their heritage, of their Protestant heritage, and of the victory of William of Orange over James's Irish Catholic forces. And unfortunately, they use that often as an opportunity to continue their prejudicial behavior and quite frankly, terroristic activities at times against native Gaelic Irish that live in Northern Ireland. And that continues to some degree to this day. So now we have this, but which we have a Protestant dominated culture in Northern Ireland. And in fact, across the entire island now, the Protestants are ascendant and they control a lot of aspects of life. They control political life, educational life, religious life. You'll note in my bullet points here that Protestants, again, Presbyterians didn't always fare well under this regency, under this rule either. And there were problems, but the penal laws were slowly but surely reversed by most of them in the 1700s. By the mid 1800s, that was it. And life became normal on the island, but again, prejudicial for those who were not part of the dominant Protestant culture, particularly in the North. This carries on for a good while. I can go through, and I'm actually going to sort of skip over the famine because it doesn't even play into our story, although it obviously ravaged Ireland. We're going to get to the late 1900s and the turn of the century. There's now a movement in Ireland for some degree of local political control, home rule. All decisions have been made by Westminster's Parliament, and people felt that they should have a voice in determining the activities of their daily lives, their laws, their judicial systems, and they wanted what's called a devolved government that gave them an opportunity to have voice in the decisions that affected them. Not unlike perhaps Washington, D.C. in a way. And there were a series of bills passed in Parliament to provide a home rule structure for them. The problem was World War I was got into the way of the opportunity for this to happen. And we don't quite understand World War I, and we certainly don't understand it the way the Irish, and particularly those in Ulster, understand it. They sacrificed a great deal to fight there, and they did that for king and crown. King George was the king. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of men from Ulster served, and many died in World War I. I know my great uncle died in 1917 fighting in the war. So they were opposed to it. Catholics, somewhat, Irish definitely, of Gaelic heritage, wanted home rule. The army has been used to fight the Germans in Europe, and therefore their military forces to sort of protect the government in Dublin were really de minimis. And the Sinn Féin political party, with its military wing, the Irish Republican Army, saw an opportunity. And in Easter Sunday, 1916, they mounted a coup to overthrow the British government in Dublin and take control of government buildings. And they did for a while. Several days they actually held out. They were, in fact, eventually captured and summarily executed. And the British realized that they had a problem, but the Irish there realized they had an opportunity. And immediately on the conclusion of World War I, begins a war in Ireland between the Irish Republican Army and the British Army for control of the land. While Parliament sort of perks up and pays attention, says, well, maybe we should do something here to give these folks some sense of their own control and their destiny. Let's do that. Let's give them a home rule effect. And what happened when they proposed it? They very quickly realized that the people in the North didn't want any parts of that. We're part of the Union. We're staying part of the Union. You don't have to give us our own government. We're good. We'll deal with Westminster because we're part of the United Kingdom. And the people in the South said, yeah, we want our own local government in Dublin. Thank you so very much. And so what happens, we get the divide in 1921. Now, all of this land is still part of the United Kingdom. But in the North, everybody says we don't want a devolved government. We'll take our marching orders from Westminster. Thank you very much. And in the South, no, we're going to have our local government. And then they proceeded to have their own internal civil war as to whether or not they wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom or have some other structure. The IRA and Sinn Féin versus the IRA and Sinn Féin, and it's the Irish Civil War. And it's a terrible thing indeed. They finally came to what's called the Irish Free State, part of the United Kingdom, but now, instead of being a combined part, it's actually a Commonwealth component, like Canada or Australia or other places. And then they moved from that to declaring themselves simply Ireland. We're Ireland, which implied control of the North. And then in 1948, they actually created the Republic of Ireland and withdrew from the Commonwealth. So it's a freestanding, independent country. So we've got two countries on the same geography with a border, and that border sort of begins to place some problems. That's where we are going through the 1940s and the 1950s, okay? There are some problems this post-separation, and it's simply this. There is, in fact, a dominant Protestant culture, which is the majority of people living in Northern Ireland. And the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which is there, is controlled almost exclusively by these people. And the dominant political party, the Ulster Unionist Party, again, dominated by people who think of themselves as Unionists, Loyalists, and Protestant. And they discriminate in jobs, housing, policing, education opportunities against Gaelic Irish who are living in Northern Ireland. No question about that. There's a lot of mutual self-separation. We're going to go live in this neighborhood and we're going to go live in that neighborhood. The shipyards and all the other places of employment were basically controlled by Protestants who did not give Catholics good work opportunities. And down on the border, the Irish Republican Army continues to fight guerrilla battles back and forth across this border. Little picture here of both the Titanic and the Olympic ships being built at the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast circa 1910. Fabulous. As you well know, the Titanic didn't make it. It was 111 years ago yesterday. It sank, by the way. The Olympic stage served all the way through World War II. So, you know, sometimes they build them just so, I guess. Yeah, I'm going to come back to that slide just a second, because here's what I want to tell you. We're into the 50s, we're into the 60s. As you well know, here in the United States, we have a civil rights movement. Peaceful marches and protests to provide rights to the Blacks in this country, voting rights, particularly in the South, and people march and they do that. That civil rights movement had spillover effect all over the world. And it had spillover effect in Northern Ireland. They created the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And these were the Gaelic Irish in Ulster who wanted to use the civil rights movement as a mechanism to move forward their beliefs. And so they did, and they held a series of protest marches. Now we look at that and say, well, that's fine, but if you'll stop and think about our own history of protest marches, there was pushback and resistance. Right? There were bombings, there were hoses, there were rocks, there were dogs set loose because change was not appreciated. And very much in Northern Ireland, the same thing occurred. Unionists felt that this was nothing more than a sort of a nose under the camel's tent mechanism by which the Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Army could begin to gain control of Northern Ireland and bring it back into the Republic. And they were highly opposed to it. So this is what we get. The Civil Rights Association attempting to focus on some very basic issues that were important to the quality of their lives. Electoral reform, that their votes actually mattered because it was a bad districting system. Policing reforms, as I said, the RUC was highly discriminatory against them. Housing and how housing was represented in voting mattered, and employment opportunities. And so they marched. And one of the more important marches of that time was a march in January of '69 from Belfast to Derry, which is about a 70-mile distance, a multi-day march of a lot of civil rights people. And as they approached Derry, basically the day before they would have gotten there, they came to an area called the Burdhullet Bridge. And that's the photograph up above. And as you can see, they're marching sort of down in a cut. And Unionists came up over the bank and stoned them. And that's exactly what you're seeing in that photograph. Pushed back by the Irish in the Derry Bogside area, which is the home of them. We'll take a look at that. They had literally a battle to push the RUC out of their neighborhoods and to keep them from ever being able to patrol there again. This sparks a huge response by Unionist forces, specifically the Ulster Defense Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force. And it's a terror campaign against Catholics living in Protestant communities. Those of you who have seen the movie Belfast, this is exactly what we're describing in 1969. And this was exactly what happened. Get them out, burn them out, and everybody has to agree with us or else. Huge troubles as a result of this. And as you can see, there were deaths, housing displacements, businesses burned in the ground. And now we're beginning the troubles. This is where it all comes together. All right. So who are the players? It kind of matters who's who. Here's what we've got. Again, green and orange, nationalists and Republicans here, unionists and loyalists there. The big players, the provisional IRA, the old IRA, the original Irish Republican Army of the 1920s, these are old men living on their memories and they're retired. But this is a younger, harder, less forgiving group of people who are very comfortable with very difficult tactics to gain control of the land. Opposing them primarily the Ulster Defense Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force. Again, all of these are paramilitary forces. They have no legal standing whatsoever. They are in fact terrorists on both sides, trying to gain control on both sides. Sort of standing in the middle, trying to create some peace mechanism. In Northern Ireland, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and I've put that in orange because they were quite tainted that way. In Ireland, because this was across the border, the Irish Defence Forces and their police force, the Gardaí, attempted to control movement and activities along the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And then the British realized that they had to do something to protect those at risk in Northern Ireland. So the British Armed Forces came in as a peacekeeping group to be able to protect the lives primarily of Catholics and people identified as Irish in Northern Ireland. Now, there's a problem here. Every hammer thinks everything it sees is a nail. It's a classic thing. And to untrained, young, uneducated British soldiers led by very narrow thinking officers. Everybody looked like a terrorist. Everybody's a suspect. Better safe than sorry. And so very quickly, their very ham-handed approach to peacekeeping went awry. And a lot of incidents in which they should not have acted, they did. I think the biggest one I'll come to in just a second. Bombing becomes the mechanism of terrorist attacks. In Belfast, the UVF thought they could take out the IRA leadership by bombing a bar. They missed the leaders, but they managed to kill 15 people, including 2 children. And then the IRA, or excuse me, the British military pulls one of the greatest blunders of all time. January 30th, 1972, the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association wants to stage a march from their Bogside area in Derry down to the Guildhall. And it's a protest march. And the British really don't want them to march. Tell them, well, don't come any further than this. And they've got all of their troops out, and these troops are armed, and they have their rifles, and somebody opens fire. And before anybody can blink, 14 people are shot. None of them had a gun. It was slaughter. I've been there. I've looked. You couldn't miss. It's fish in a barrel. It's a terrible thing. Picture here is a rather famous photograph of Father Edward Daly, literally waving a handkerchief for troops to be able to carry an injured young man out of the line of fire. The young man later died. This was a terrible tragedy, and the British were totally in the wrong. It took 38 years for the apology. 2 commissions. This was the Savile Commission, and finally was begun in 98. And finally in 2010, they issued the apology and it was David Cameron that said this was unjustified and unjustifiable. True. And those words probably did more to bring peace in Derry than anything else. It was called for, it was important. So this is life in the Troubles. Response by the IRA, let's bomb Belfast. And so Bloody Friday is the reprisal bomb later that year, setting off 20-something bombs in 80 minutes, killing 9, injuring 130. In response, Unionist UVF and UDA groups began to actively pursue terrorism against Catholics. And now we're in the heart of the Troubles. We're living in a land where you don't know if you're safe. Can I walk down this street? What's in that car? Who are those people? It's that bank. Because any of that could take your life, and it was random to the average person. Everybody was involved. Everybody knew somebody who was involved in the killings or the holding of weapons on both sides. And this begins to separate people out as a solution. In Derry, the Irish Gaelic in Derry said, that's it, the British will never come into our neighborhood again. There will be no patrols. And they created Free Derry and blockaded their neighborhoods to keep them out. So the British Army forces built these huge observation towers up on the walls of the city to look down into the neighborhoods, because that's all they could do. Those towers were there at least through 2001, because when I was there in Derry, I saw them still there. In Belfast, where you've got Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods adjacent to each other, a series of walls were built to separate them and to minimize terrorist activity between the 2 neighborhoods, which was a daily occurrence. You're sitting out in your porch and all of a sudden a bomb comes flipping into your front yard. That's what happened. So they built what are called peace walls, which are still there to this day, and we'll see them when we go there. And there were barriers of various kinds erected in other cities, such as Armagh, to block traffic and movement of people. So this is the time of the Troubles. This is when it's really, really, really bad. A code of silence emerges, and you can see that poster. I'll speak to that in just a minute. Everybody knew somebody, but nobody could say anything. Touting can seriously injure your health. one down here, the provos are the people are the provos. And spray painted on the walls of Derry, God made the Catholics and the Armalite made us equal. That's a frightening concept. One of the greatest poets of all time, Seamus Heaney, from Ireland, got a Nobel Prize, from Belfast, actually. In 1975, had seen that poster up there and it called him to write a poem. And I've actually got a copy of it for all of you. It's a pretty powerful poem. And I'm going to read just a piece or two of it to give you a sense of it. Religion's never mentioned here, of course. You know them by their eyes, and hold your tongue. One side's as bad as the other, never worse. And whatever you say nothing. Smoke signals are loud mouth compared with us. Maneuverings to find out name in school. Subtle discrimination by addresses, with hardly an exception to the rule. That Norman, Ken, and Sydney signaled prod, and Seamus, call me Sean, was surefire paper. A land of password, hand grip, wink, and nod. Of open minds, as open as a trap. That was the reality of life in Northern Ireland. And you never knew, and you never knew. And it wasn't just in Northern Ireland. The idea of a terrorist organization attempting to drive control of a land into another country exceeded that. We'll take a look at that. The terrorists began to be arrested on both sides. The British were really good at creating informants in their organizations. And so terrorists were interned, terrorists were found guilty, terrorists were put into prison. A lot of them, particularly in the Maze prison outside of Belfast. Bobby Sands, provisional IRA member, and along with his colleagues claim that they are not in fact terrorists, but they are soldiers of war and deserve to be treated as soldiers of war under the Geneva Convention. The British are having none of it, so Bobby Sands goes on strike with his colleagues. This brings international attention to what's occurring in Northern Ireland. Oddly enough, Sinn Féin puts Bobby Sands up for office while he's in prison, and he wins a seat to Parliament. He died 9 days later. And more importantly, his colleagues died at the end of the month. This began to shift what's occurring. And people are beginning to think that maybe this is a political struggle and needs not be a terrorist armed struggle. But again, the IRA are pursuing a mechanism to take this everywhere that people might be able to make a decision. Prior slide, I think I pointed out, they killed Lord Mountbatten and 3 members of his family in Ireland, in the Republic, not in the North, because his home was in Sligo. They bomb Regent's Park and Hyde Park in London. They put up a mortar attack on 10 Downing Street. This is significant advanced war and terror. But what happens in Northern Ireland, everybody knows somebody. Everybody knows somebody who's been hurt. Everybody knows somebody who's been kneecapped, talking or not talking, shot in the knee so that you cannot walk, kneecapped. There was a typical terrorist mechanism to enforce compliance, and it was often done not so much against the other, but against your own people to keep them in line. Very typical thing. People have become slowly but hardly sick of it. And quite frankly, Sinn Féin begins to realize that there's no good end to an ongoing military action in the North. Political means might be better. And quite frankly, the British have had a belly full of it too, because they don't understand why they continue to go there, fight, and lose soldiers and get a political black eye for doing it. So change slowly in the early 90s begins to develop. In 1994, both Sinn Féin and the Socialist, Democrat, and Labour Party leaders have talks to end violence. Jerry Adams, leader of Sinn Féin, noted terrorist, is given a passport to be able to come to the United States of America and goes to the White House and talks with President Bill Clinton. That didn't play particularly well in Ulster, I've got to be honest. Not only among the Unionists, but also among some Loyalists who doubted his sincerity. Needless to say, things got a little better. The British began having talks with the UDA and UDF folks, and we send, well, I'll get to that in a second. The terrorist combatant forces declare a ceasefire. First, the provisional IRA, and then followed by Unionist forces of the UVF, the UDA, and the Red Hand Commando. So everybody says, we're gonna try a ceasefire and see how this goes. Bill Clinton sends George Mitchell to Northern Ireland, and he begins talking. And he sets up a whole bunch of interesting ground rules. Everybody has to be at the table, including the combatants, the terrorist leaders, as well as political leaders. And he won't talk to anybody outside of those meetings because he doesn't want to be seen as partisan. And he basically talked them into an agreement. In Northern Ireland, this was a great relief. People could actually see maybe there's a future for us. Maybe this will work. And sure enough, it takes a while for this to happen. An agreement is reached in April of 1998 between all the major parties to change the nature of the political landscape in Ireland. And from that, peace should flow. Ireland, Northern Ireland, for the first time, is actually acknowledged to exist by the Republic of Ireland. And they voted to take out of their constitution the fact that that's their land being held by somebody else. Those living in the north could identify as Irish or British or both. It could have not only their British passport, but also an Irish passport if they choose. Political control begins to devolve out of Westminster, and there will be political control in Belfast with power sharing among these major disagreeing factions. Sinn Féin for the Irish Republicans, and then the Ulster Unionist Party, now the Democratic Unionist Party, is the majority party for those who are Loyalists and Unionists. They decommissioned the paramilitaries, at least those that were willing to, and they stood down their arms and said, we will never take up arms again. The Royal Ulster Constabulary becomes the revised police service of Northern Ireland, and they ensure that it has representation from many of the minority communities as part of what's happening there. Prisoner release for both sides, regardless of what you had done, regardless of what your crimes were, you were released forthwith. That's it, you're out. Go about your life. A lot of language around human rights and equality and linguistic diversity. Irish can be taught in schools in Northern Ireland. Irish signs can be put up in addition to the English signs as road signs. That last part hasn't worked out well to my knowledge so far, and it's just this year they got 4 signs in Belfast that have Irish language on them. So it's a slow process. And one of the biggest pieces, an acknowledgement on all sides that there was a significant minority that wanted to reunite Northern Ireland with Ireland, and a vote could be taken later in an appropriate time, undetermined, of both the citizens of Northern Ireland and the Republic about reuniting them into one country. And it's still hanging out there to this day. This was voted by not only the citizens of Northern Ireland, but also citizens of the Republic, won by overwhelming majorities. 72% of those voting in the North agreed to this. 94% of those voting in the Republic agreed to this. Huge. And the numbers of people voting are numbers that we don't know about. 88% of the Northern Irish voted. We haven't had 88% of people vote in this country in an election forever. It's astounding. This is the damage done. A lot of people killed, a lot of people injured, almost 37,000 shootings, 16,000 bombings. Someone died every day of the year. And most of the people were under the age of 25. It was the youth. It absolutely was the youth. So what do we get? Changed future. It's the goal. Crime rates down. Lots of people working in the tech sector, highly rated as a place to start a business, good economic opportunity, a lot of tourism, movie making. The picture on the left is the Hands Across the Divide, which is this beautiful statue on the Craigavon Bridge leading into Derry. And if we, as we go to Derry, we should go over the bridge and see that. On the far right is the Titanic Belfast Museum in honor of the building of the Titanic. It's actually on the former shipyards, one of the best museums I've ever been in. We'll argue about getting there. We're gonna back and forth on that a little. And in the middle, Northern Ireland's become a place for filmmaking. And one of the great film series that was shot, not exclusively there, but a lot of it there, was Game of Thrones, if any of you have seen it. And this is the Darkwood. And we have somebody that wants to go see the Darkwood on our trip. So we're,
I've seen it.
oh, there you go. So lots of things have gotten better in Northern Ireland. And there's absolutely no question about it. There are some unresolved issues. There was never a truth and reconciliation process. So fact-finding and acceptance of responsibility has never happened as, say, it did in South Africa at the end of apartheid. And a lot of people, I'd say the majority of people in Northern Ireland, do not have closure on that process. Loved ones killed, loved ones disappear. They know that those people were responsible, but those people don't stand up and say, I am responsible. So that hasn't happened. And it leaves a sense of post-traumatic stress disorder across most of the population that is, say, over the age of 35. Political power sharing, which is set up in the Belfast Agreement, has essentially failed. The two major parties, the Sinn Féin and the DUP, have one person is the first minister and is the prime minister, and the second one is the first minister, but they have to both agree to do it, and they don't. And it's failed. Stormont's failed at least 5 times. That's their parliament. It's in the picture. It's failed at least 5 times that I'm aware of. It's shut down from 2017 to 2020 and from 2022 to today. They don't have a government. Now, those of us who look at that and say, how is that possible? Well, I will tell you something. The country actually works pretty well without sitting government. There's a lesson for us there. I'm just saying. Okay? The buses and the trains are running just fine. Okay. IRA spin-off terrorist organizations continue to this day, and I'll show you some stuff in a minute here. The UDA has gone back to its original function, which is effectively organized crime. It makes its money through prostitution, through drugs, and through protection rackets, preying on its own. Ulster Unionists and Protestants in their neighborhoods, and it's a huge problem. Brexit has thrown everything into a real tizzy because the United Kingdom pulled out of the European Union. And now what about this border, and what about trade, and what about free movement? And it's really made a mess not only of that, but of everybody's feelings about it. And that's another hour presentation.
Their currency is the euro?
Their currency is the pound, and it always was. They didn't want to, they're not part of that. Never have been. Pound
The
sterling.
Irish pound
No,
in Ireland.
in Ireland is no, Ireland's part of the euro. The Republic of Ireland is part of the euro, but the Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, it's the British pound sterling. Now, peace remains terribly elusive. In Omagh, 4 months after the Belfast Agreement was created, the worst bomb in the history of the Troubles went off. It's a Saturday market day in a small town near the border. Lovely town. Everybody's there on a Saturday afternoon, and a car bomb explodes, killing 29 people, including a woman pregnant with twins. These were Irish, these were Protestants, these were Catholic, these were foreign visitors. Just a terrible bomb. Weir McKee, and in fact, there was a movie last night at the Weir Theater, a documentary presented that Hillary Clinton is supporting. Weir McKee was this lovely, lovely young woman, journalist, and that's her with the glasses, and her partner with her. She was covering a disturbance in a suburb of Derry in April of 2019, and was summarily shot dead by real IRA forces for no apparent reason whatsoever. She was a non-combatant journalist taking notes. The walls, which we talked about, they're still there. bigger than ever. 97 miles of them. They were supposed to be removed. The government agreed 15 years ago, we're going to take all the walls down. Well, they're still there. They still function, and some of those gates are locked at night. We'll take a look at that when we're there in June. And the new IRA continues its terrorist activities. So that's it. There's peace. People feel comfortable sleeping at night, but there's still terroristic activities in this land. And I'm not sure if it'll ever be resolved. These are two sectarian groups that will never see eye to eye. So that's it. That's all of it.
Real quickly, I'd like to propose a vote of thanks for this wonderful presentation. The only problem that I see is surely it was Edward VII was the king during World War I, not George V. But that's a.
Well, yeah, by then it was, but at the time of
Okay,
home
I
rules
beg your pardon.
proposal, and I'll tell you why I mentioned that, because there's a thing here. Ulster didn't want to be a part of it. And there it is. The second thing, it's very hard for you to read on this slide.
See John Bull.
Yeah, the men of Ulster did not want home rule at the time of World War I. And in 1912, September 28th, I think is the date, they signed the Ulster's Solemn League and Covenant, pledging their support to King George V. On one Saturday at the end of September, 500,000 Ulstermen went to their local churches and parishes, and they all signed this document to demonstrate they didn't want the devolved home rule. That document has actually been imaged and data recorded, and you can go online and search who signed it and where they were. And I did that, and both my grandfather and my great-grandfather's signatures right there on that document. Other
You
questions?
also talk about sort of the gerrymandering of why they left the three
Yeah,
counties of Ulster out.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. Thank you. I'm gonna go back to the beginning. There it is. Yeah, the North includes traditionally not only Antrim, Down, Armagh, Londonderry, Tyrone, and Fermanagh. It also includes way up here, Donegal and Monaghan and Cavan. And all of those areas are traditionally Irish, Gaelic. In fact, one of the great places that they still speak Gaelic is up in Donegal. And they were all predominantly Catholic. And it was very clear that that would not work well in a unionist Protestant country. And so they wanted to exclude them. There are really two good reasons. One, to keep a unionist majority in the North, no question about that. But the other thing they also did was take away the opportunity for a lot of warfare in those counties, because those people were going to go back and forth fighting. So it actually sort of took off the board what would have been an even more involved fight along the border, because these people are now in Ireland and not in the United Kingdom, and they were less inclined to be involved in that struggle. Other questions? Yeah, proof.
What's the average everyday life now in Northern Ireland? Do they get to be friends with each other? I understand there's still walls up there separating them, and
There are walls. Yeah, people get to be friends. It's a lovely place to be. I mean,
Protestant and Catholic can be friends there now.
they can, they do intermarry. Here's the thing, generations change. The cultural prescription against interfaith marriages has kind of gone away. Well, faith has kind of gone away too, to be perfectly honest. But yes, on a day-to-day basis, but people still live among the people they know best and stay in those communities. But yeah,
So
sure.
they're more or less separated in communities by.
They still are.
Protestant and Catholic.
Yeah, kind of like white and black here, same deal.
And what about this mafia, Irish mafia that sells women and stuff? Was that the Protestants or the Catholics?
Not familiar with an Irish mafia per
We
se.
backed out mafias on there. You said there's a group.
The
that-
organized crime.
Oh, there's organized crime. Yeah, there is absolutely organized crime. And yes, prostitution involves a lot of smuggling in refugees from Central Europe.
Are those the Catholic or the
Protestant.
Protestant
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
that?
Protestant, the Protestant affiliated, let me put it that way, the unionists. The real IRA, they're just a straight up
straight on terrorist group attempting to take control of Northern Ireland and give it back to the Republic of Ireland and turn the entire island into a socialist country. That's a stated platform of them. Roger.
Could I give a plug for the Little Theatre of Alexandria? You mentioned the two queens,
Yep.
Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth I, and they are doing a play there in a short time on those two queens.
What are the talks in Northern Ireland right now that have been started?
They're trying to figure out how to get back into Stormont. And part of that has to do with whether or not the Democratic Unionist Party will accept the most current terms of Brexit. Brexit's sort of been modified
Yes.
over time to allow for some modification of the trade rules. The problem the DUP has is it still gives judicial control over trade issues to the European Union, and they just don't want any parts of that.
Right.
That's the kind of the sticking point that's there.
And isn't there now a Catholic majority in Northern Ireland?
Well, yeah, there's a Catholic plurality in Northern Ireland. There are more Catholics than there are Protestants by declared faith. But just like here, the nuns are leading the race. And if you ask the average citizen of Ireland whether they are Catholic or Protestant, it's becoming a non-meaningful question for the majority of them. Old people like us, sure, we identify by our religion, no question about it, and we go to church on Sunday. Most people in Ireland, as with all of Europe, don't. And that's just the nature of the beast. I got some folks here that are going to go. You're going to go, right?
Do y'all have any questions?
Yeah. What do you need to know? There's going to be a quiz.
Oh, there might be.
Come home if you don't pass.
Yeah, really.
We're gonna have a trivia game, low stakes.
Yeah.
Could you go back to the slide with the adult talk stuff and
Sure.
explain the writing you talked about on the wall? I gotta look about that.
Right here.
Yeah, the bottom right
Bottom,
photo.
this one?
Bottom
No.
right.
Not right. Oh,
What does that mean?
what if God made the Catholics? We're Catholic and we're in a minority, but the Armalite, the AR-15 made us equal. That's what that means. Yeah. And they got their money. The IRA primarily got the money to fund their terrorist activities from the United States. Citizens who thought it was a wonderful, noble cause. They mostly got their training, their arms, and their explosives from Libya. Yeah. The terrorist forces of the UDA and UDF, they got their money through their own criminal activities. A fair number of their arms came to them through South Africa and a few from Russia, curiously enough. Okay, I have for everybody resources because there's so much here. Thank you all very much.